Hello friends, welcome to Coding Garden. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up a React and TypeScript app with Vite. But we're not just gonna set up a basic app, we're also going to get all of our developer tooling set up as well. So once we get the basic app up and going, we're also going to set up eslint, which makes sure that we write consistent code. We're also going to set up the eslint airbnb config, which is more opinionated and more rules about how we style and structure our code. And then we're also going to set up prettier, which has a lot of opinions on how to format our code. After we get all of that working, then we're going to set up testing, and specifically unit testing on the front end. This video is just starting, but you've probably been watching YouTube all day. Look away from the screen, take a quick stretch, and then we'll get right into it. So lastly, we will set up unit testing. So specifically, we're going to use this library called vitest, which is a blazing fast unit test framework. We're going to combine that with jest-dom, which is DOM in pure JavaScript. And then we're going to use this thing called testing library. Going to combine all those together, and we're going to get some nice unit testing for our React app. And then lastly, we'll just set up a little React router. Let's go. So first step is to generate an app using Vite. If you go to vitejs.dev, you can read more about it. And I am specifically going to run this command. So I'm using npm. If you're using yarn or pnpm, just follow those commands instead. But I'm going to run this command right here, and it's going to ask me some questions. So I'm going to call this React TS app. I want React-TS, so this will automatically set up a TS config for me. And then now, if we go into there, we can take a look. And while we're taking a look, I'll go ahead and do an npm install to get all of the dependencies installed. But if you take a look at the package.json, you can see we have a dependency on React and React-DOM. That's so that we can write React. We have a dependency on the types, so we can use TypeScript with them. And then we have a dependency on the Vite plugin for React, a dependency on Vite, and a dependency on TypeScript. All of these are dev dependencies. So these dependencies are only working for us locally so that we have a good developer experience. Great. You can see the scripts. We have npm run dev, which will just run Vite, npm run build, which will build and bundle our Vite app, and then preview, which I believe will preview the built version of the app. We can see that we do get a tsconfig, and there are two tsconfigs. So the tsconfig.json with like lib dom, etc., is the TypeScript config used by our React code. Because that React code is going to need to get turned into JavaScript that can run inside of the web browser, and this config specifically does that. This one is for Vite itself. So we can configure Vite with TypeScript. So we can see we have this viteconfig.ts, but Vite is running on our machine with node.js. So it needs a slightly different tsconfig. So that's why we have two tsconfigs. And then we also have this index.html. So this is essentially our entry point. And you can see how this stuff is working. So Vite has a reference to our main.tsx file. And this is kind of weird, right? You've probably never seen an HTML file mixing TSX, because usually TSX is TypeScript with JSX, but that isn't referenced directly in HTML. It's actually like bundled, and then like your React app is mounted. But Vite works in a very interesting way. So if our dependencies are installed, if I do npm run dev, we should get a Vite app to spin up. It might be on a different port for you, but I have a bunch of stuff on my machine, so it just gives me the first available port. And here we go, we have a Vite app. But if we look at the source code of the page, we can see some interesting stuff going on. So you can see right here, it has a reference to source main.tsx, but when I click on it, I see some weird stuff. So essentially what Vite and esbuild behind the scenes have done is when the web browser requests this file, it actually transpiles it into JavaScript on the fly. So if you look at the actual source main.tsx file, it's your pretty standard React setup, right? Import React, import our app component, and then mount it in the DOM right there. But the way Vite handles this is basically when that file is requested on the fly, it transpiles it, and then that's what's get loaded into the browser. So the code we write looks like this, but when it runs through TypeScript and esbuild, it ends up looking like this, which is cool. So yeah, that's that HTML right there. We just reference that one file, it loads it in, and then vite handles the rest. So that's our main entry point. You can see that it's referencing index.css. These are just global CSS styles. While we're in here, I'm just going to go ahead and rip them out because we won't have any basic CSS to start. If we take a look at the app.tsx, this is our main component. Let's also rip some stuff out of here too. So we can see that it's importing app.css. This is still technically global CSS, even though it's being imported like this. So for now, I'm actually just going to straight up delete app.css as well. And then let's reconfigure this component to get rid of all the stuff we don't need. So I don't want that React logo. For now, we're not going to have use state. I'm literally just going to have a div that says hello world. Like this. And so this is our basic React app. And if we go back over here, boom, we see it's nice and ugly with just like that default Times New Roman font. Awesome. And then I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this react.svg because we're not using it. And right now, if you look in the index.html, it is referencing vite.svg as the favicon. Referencing it as the icon. But I'm going to get rid of that. If you want to add a favicon, you could just put one in the public folder and replace it. So I'm going to get rid of that as well. In the past, people have asked me, what's the difference between that assets folder and that public folder? Here's my answer for that. If you have assets that need to be bundled in some way, so they need to run through some loader that will minify them or transform them in some way, it makes sense to put them in the assets folder. If you have assets, static assets that don't need any sort of processing, you can just put those directly in the public folder, and these are going to get copied over to your build. All right. That is it for generating the app and the quick preview. Next up, we are going to configure eslint and all of the associated formatting and linting tools as well. Yeah, and so that's the other cool thing is like the nice thing about vite is the hot reloading is blazingly fast, and unironically so. So there's my my little React app over there. Watch this. Watch how fast. So I'm gonna press Command S. Boom! Like instant. Right, are you ready? Command S. Boom. So like vite, hot reloading and page refreshing is insane. And it's all because of this thing esbuild. It's using this under the hood. Yeah, so vite is essentially combining esbuild and rollup into a really fast and really good developer experience. Yeah, wow. So to set up eslint, the first thing we need to do is install eslint as a dev dependency. So I'm going to go ahead and kill the vite app. And if I do npm i-D eslint, that'll install eslint as a dev dependency. And if we take a look at our app and we take a look at that package.json, we should now see eslint in our dev dependencies. Good to go. All right, now that we have eslint installed as a dev dependency, we can do npx eslint --init. So again, when you do npx, it's going to look in the node modules folder. So because we just installed eslint, it'll run it from there. And then --init is their command line tool, so that way we can generate a basic configuration. So for now, I'm just going to choose check syntax and find problems. After we get this initial base set up, we're going to install some other plugins to get the configuration that I like. We are using imports and exports. We're using React. We are using TypeScript. Our code is running inside the browser because this is a React app, and the config file will be in the JavaScript format. So you can see that this is also going to install these dependencies. So plugin React, TypeScript eslint plugin, TypeScript eslint parser. This allows TypeScript to work in conjunction with eslint. And I'm using npm, so we can install these. So after running that, we should have a basic eslint config. You can see right here, this eslintrc.cjs. And you can see that it's extending eslint recommended, plugin React, all of that good stuff. But there are a few other plugins that I want to install. So first of all, Airbnb. So the Airbnb style guide is a style guide released by the Airbnb company that describes how they like to write JavaScript and React code. And it's just a bunch of their opinions, because there's a lot of ways to do it, a lot of different ways you could write a functional component, or a lot of different ways you could do various things. And so they have a bunch of rules where they've defined all of that ahead of time. And I want to pull those into my eslint config, so that way I don't have to configure those rules manually. And essentially by installing this, we are going to get all of those default rules. So now to install eslint config Airbnb, we're going to run this command, because there are a few other dependencies we need along with eslint config Airbnb. You can see when we generated our eslint config, we did get eslint plugin React and the TypeScript eslint plugin and parser, but we didn't get things like eslint plugin React hooks, eslint plugin JSX A11Y. We didn't get any of these. So if we run this command, it's going to install eslint config Airbnb and all of the things that it depends on. So I'm going to copy that command from here and run it. And install peer deps is specifically a command line tool that's going to find those peer dependencies and then install them as well. So you can see now what it's doing. It's installing eslint config Airbnb, eslint, which we already had, eslint plugin import, and all of these other things. So it installed all of those. And then now we can see we have a bunch more plugins in here as well. Awesome. So now that it's installed, we can add it to our config. So specifically in the extends section of our eslint, we want to add Airbnb and Airbnb hooks. So if we go over to our eslint here, I'm actually going to get rid of eslint recommended, and I'm going to add these in. Airbnb essentially overrides eslint recommended. Airbnb has all of the things, all of the rules, all the things I want and need. So once I put it there, we're not extending from eslint recommended anymore. And you can see I instantly got, the moment I saved that, I got some red squiggly lines. And you can see that expected indentation of 4 spaces, but found 8. So the Airbnb config enforces I believe a 2-space tab. And so now that I have that, if I do Command-Shift-P, eslint fix all auto-fixable problems, now it's taken the default rules that Airbnb likes and prefers, and it's applied that to this specific file. So that's great. Next up, we need these rules to also support TypeScript. So there's a plugin for that. This plugin, eslint config Airbnb TypeScript. I can install it as a dev dependency here. You can see in their description, they say, hey, you need that thing we just installed, eslint config Airbnb. And then they also say that you need eslint plugin and parser, which we do have. If you remember, when we generated our config, we got these 2 things when we told it that we were using TypeScript. So we already have those. We only need to install this. So now I will do an npmi-D eslint config Airbnb TypeScript. And then now we get something else that we can extend. And we specifically are using React, so we want this Airbnb-TypeScript. This is saying if you're not in a React app, you would do it this way. But we want that. And so if we go back over to our config, right here, we're going to do Airbnb TypeScript. So now we have rules for our TypeScript files as well. So you can see now that I added Airbnb TypeScript, we're getting this ugly error right here. But essentially what we need to do is down here in our parserOptions, we need to tell eslint how to or where to find our TypeScript config. And if you look in the docs over here, they tell us that we need to do this. So we need to add this project section to our parserOptions. Make sure that you're not adding a new key. Make sure you go down to where the parserOptions are and you put this there. Now, when you save this, this should work. Let's actually reload the window. So if you do Command-Shift-P, reload window, that's going to reload our TypeScript server and our eslint server just to make sure everything is fresh and like nothing's stale. So we didn't see that error pop up, which is great, but now we have another error we need to fix. If we highlight over this, this is telling us that we have the parserOptions set, but it does not match this specific file. So basically right now, we told it, hey, that's how we configure TypeScript. But what it's saying is, hey, your config file isn't being looked at by TypeScript. So we need to go to our TypeScript config and tell it to that we should be looking at this specific file here. So if we go to our tsconfig.json, there's this section called include, and we can add as many things as we want in here. I'm essentially just going to add a new element that is the name of my eslint file, eslintrc.cjs. So now specifically TypeScript is pointed at that file, and then now eslint is pointed back at TypeScript. So now these two can work well together. And again, I'm going to have to reload the window, but that should pick up that setting. So if we give it a second, and also you can see this down here. So if you see these spinning things, that's the JavaScript language service and everything else. If all of that settles and you don't see any errors, then you know that we've fixed them all. So at this point, we've connected together our eslint config and our TypeScript config, and we are now using the Airbnb rules. So at this point, we can see what we get. So specifically, I have the extension eslint installed. So if you search the VS Code extension store for eslint, you want to make sure that you have it installed and enabled. But now, because we have those two config files, if we look at, for instance, our main.tsx, we get some red squiggly lines. And if we hover over these, this says missing semicolon. So I like to have semicolons in my JavaScript code, and specifically we extended from the Airbnb rules, and there's a rule in here that says semicolons are required. So I like that rule. I'm gonna use it, but you could technically turn that rule off or say you don't want semicolons. But you can see there's lots of errors, and I could manually go in and do like this and then like this. But when there are errors that eslint can automatically fix, we can run a command for that. You can see this is complaining about a missing comma, but if you do Command-Shift-P and then search for eslint and choose Fix All Auto-Fixable Problems, anything that's auto-fixable in this one file will get fixed. So you can see now instantly it added the semicolons where it needed and it added the comma. Good to go. We only have one other file we need to worry about, which is this app.tsx. I'm going to run Fix All Auto-Fixable Problems, but then we run into an issue that we need to fix as well. So if you hover over the div here, this is saying React must be in scope when using JSX. Now, this used to be the case for older React, but with the latest version of React, you actually don't need to import React. It used to be that you had to do something like this, import React from React, and then you didn't even use it. But the latest version of React has been updated, so you don't need to do that, but we need to tell eslint that we don't need to do that. We're actually going to disable this rule, and I'm going to show you a few different ways to disable the rule, but essentially if you come across a linter rule that you don't agree with or you want to disable, these are the ways to go about it. So inside of VS Code, if you do command period, you will get a few options. First you have disable this rule for this line, and if I do that, it's going to add a little comment right there, and now I don't have to worry about that linter rule. But everywhere that happens in my code base, I would need to add that comment. You could also do disable for the entire file, and that will put it at the top of the file, and now any other code that's not adhering to that rule won't complain. So I want to disable this rule for the entire project, so what I can do is take the rule name. So usually what I'll do is if I know there's something that I want to go disable for the whole project, first I'll just do it like inline, but that will give me the rule name so that I can copy it to put into my config. So I'm going to grab this rule name, and then remove this comment. And then now if I go over to my eslintrc, there's a section called rules, and we can now take rules and disable them. So I'm just going to put 0 right there, and that'll turn that rule off. So now anywhere else in my code base where that was happening, it won't throw an error anymore. So at this point, we have eslint configured, which handles all of the code style and things like missing semicolons or using single quotes versus double quotes, those kinds of things. Now we're going to install prettier, which handles our code formatting. So an example I have of that is, let's say you have some JSX element and it has a bunch of props or attributes on it. Right now, this isn't breaking any eslint rule because the line isn't long enough. I think there is a rule like if a line, yeah, so at this point, if I pasted it twice, now the line is too long. But there's a rule for really long lines, but there's not a rule about how to format, for instance, like HTML elements in their properties or JSX elements in their properties. if we install and configure Prettier to work with ESLint, we can get those rules, which also format our code, which is a good thing. So let's get going for that. The first thing we'll need is Prettier. We're going to install that as a dev dependency. We're also going to use eslint config prettier, which essentially disables rules we've enabled which would conflict with Prettier, and then eslint plugin prettier, which will make it so that all of the Prettier rules are working in conjunction with all of my eslint rules. So I need all three of these dependencies as dev dependencies. So I'll run this install. Good to go. And then now we need a configuration file. So if you look on the Prettier docs, there's this configuration file docs, and I'm going to use a CJS version. You can see there's a lot of different ways to configure it. I'm specifically going to do it this way, very similar to how we have our eslintrc.cjs. So new file .prettier.rc.cjs, and inside of that, I'm going to add the basic Prettier settings. And in my case, I prefer a two-space tab, and I prefer semicolons. They should be required. And I also prefer single quotes instead of double quotes. And those settings are very similar from the Airbnb config as well. So we have those settings. Good to go. Now we need to extend our configuration and add the Prettier plugin. So in the Prettier docs, there's a section on integrating with linters. We specifically are going to use this, and we did install this eslint plugin Prettier. So if you go to their docs, they tell you how to do it. So we need to add it to the plugins section. So if we go to our eslintrc file, scroll down to the plugin section, we're going to add Prettier right here. And then in the docs, they mention you could add the Prettier rule, but we also installed this eslint config Prettier, and what we can do is we'll add this to our extends section, and that is automatically going to enable the Prettier rules. So I'll copy this, and then in the extends section, you want to make sure that this is the very last one. So essentially, Prettier has some rules that might conflict with all of these other configs that we're extending, and so by adding that as the last one, we make sure that all of these other things work in conjunction with our Prettier rules. So at that point, I saved it. And you can see it's complaining. So this is saying replace 4 tabs with 8 tabs. I think, so if I do eslint fix all auto physical problems, right now I believe it has the wrong config, and I just need to reload the window. So right now this file is telling it that I have a tab width of 2. Prettier doesn't know that. So I'm going to do reload window, and hopefully it'll pick up those settings and realize that it told me to do the wrong thing. Let's see. Yeah, so now it's like, oh, you want a 2-space tab. Because it's like delete 2 tabs. So now if I run eslint fix all auto fixable problems, it makes it a 2-space tab. So just be sure after adding all of these configs and setting everything up, you do a reload window, or at least just close VS Code and reopen it to make sure that it's picking up all of your settings. So that file is good to go. But now watch what happens in here. So in here, we're now getting an error that it's like, hey, you need to replace this with tabs and such. So if I do eslint fix all auto fixable problems, it now pulls those Prettier rules in, and it's able to format my code, along with doing things like adding missing semicolons. So if we go back to that, like let's say I was missing some semicolons. Let's say I had that on that line and that on that line for some reason. If I run eslint fix all auto fixable problems, boom, all of that stuff is added according to my config. So we're good to go there. Next up, let's set up testing. So specifically, we're going to use this unit test framework called vitest. It's from the same creators of vite, which is what we used to scaffold out our basic project, and also what we're using to actually run our app. So when we run npm run dev, vite kicks in, spins up a dev server, and then we can actually visit our React app there. And right now we have that little dinosaur input, which is fine. But we're going to set up testing with vitest. So if we go through the getting started, they show us how to install this. First, we're going to need vitest as a dev dependency, so let's do that. So npm install -D vitest. So now that we've installed vitest, we can configure it. We can see here that on their main page, they're mentioning that we would create a vitest config. that would be separate from our vite config. But I did take a look at their examples. So they have a lot of examples set up with various test frameworks. And in this one, they just use a singular vite config. So I'm going to set it up in a similar way. I'm essentially just going to copy this config, and this config will replace my existing vite config. So if I go in here, you can see that they're importing similar things, plugin React. We have our plugins with React, the main things that we're adding. And actually, instead of copying the whole thing, I'll just copy the pieces that we need. So specifically, we need this piece here. And then we also need this test section. And you can see it says environment jest-dom. Vitest is already set up to use that if we specify it. So now that I've specified that, we're going to be using jest-dom. You can see that I am getting an issue here where it's like we don't know how to parse this file. And this is the same issue we had earlier with our eslintrc config. So if I go to my tsconfig.json, I need to add my vite.config.ts right here, so that TypeScript knows that it should be looking at that file. And then if I open my vite config back up, if I reload the window, it should stop complaining about that. So now eslint is working, TypeScript is working. I'm getting some linter errors. First, let's run eslint on this file. That adds semicolons and missing commas. And then the next issue here is eslint is complaining about vite being a dev dependency. Vite should be a dev dependency. I don't want to move it, so I'm actually just going to ignore this error for this one file. So if I do that, no extraneous dependencies, I'm only ignoring that in this file. If I have extraneous dependencies in my actual React code, that is something that I want to fix. But here, I don't need to worry about that. So at this point, we have vitest configured inside of our vite config. And now I need to create a file that will run at the beginning of every test run. And you can see right now it's referencing source/setup. I'm going to create my own file and call this setup tests. And in the source directory, I'll specifically create that file called setuptests.ts. And in here is where I can do all of my specific setup that will run before any of my test runs. All right, next up, I need to set up testing library. So vitest is our test runner. It's the thing that will find all of the test files in the directory and then run those specific tests. So when you look at the tests later, we're going to see describe, it, expect. All of those are coming from vite. But we specifically need some utilities that are going to allow us to specifically test React components. And testing library is really great for that. So if we go into their docs, click on frameworks and go to React testing library, this will show us how we can get it set up. So we specifically want @testing library/React. So I'm going to install that as a dev dependency. The other dependency we will need is specifically jest-dom expectations. So we saw in the config, our environment is jest-dom. Jest-dom is a library that essentially allows you to do DOM-like things without a web browser. And that's what we're doing in these tests. They're specifically testing React components in isolation, so they need some sort of DOM environment. But the expectations built into vite do not have all of the nice things that come along with the testing library expectations. So there specifically is a package called testing library jest-dom, and it gives you these expectations. So now when we do expect, we'll get access to things like to be disabled, to contain element, to contain HTML, to have class, these kinds of things. These are more like DOM-specific expectations. And so by installing this library, we'll get access to those in our expectations as well. So I need to install testing library React, and then testing library jest-dom, both as developer dependencies. Cool. So now that we have these dependencies, we need to set it all up. And there's this really good blog post from Marcus Oberliner, who talks about setting up jest-dom with vitest, which is what we're trying to do right now. So we just installed it as a dev dependency, but now inside of our test setup, we can add all of these extra matchers. So over here in setup tests, I can run this code. Let's run our linter really quick. But we're specifically pulling in expect from vitest, and then we are extending it with all of those jest-dom matchers that I just showed you. This is probably the error we had earlier, so no extraneous dependencies. I'm going to add this for the entire file because these are dev dependencies, and specifically when I'm inside of my test files, those are allowed to have extraneous dependencies because it's not the code that's going to be running when the app is deployed. All right, now we have all of our tests set up. Let's create our very first test. So in the source directory here, I'm going to create a file called app.test.tsx. So this is one of the things that I like to do. Other people have different opinions, but I like my tests to sit right next to the file that I'm testing. So you might see other people have a folder called tests, and then they put all of their tests in there. For me, it's nice to have the test file right next to the file that you're testing, because then you don't have to look all over the place to find it. And so I'm going to put it right there. And then the first thing we need are render and screen. So we'll pull in render and screen from testing library React. So render is going to allow us to render components, and screen is going to allow us to inspect and poke at those components to pull things out and then test against them. We're also going to need describe and it from vitest. Now you technically don't have to import these, but I like to be explicit about it. Like in other testing frameworks, describe and it are just like magic variables. I like that we're specifically importing them, and then we should get some autocomplete as well. So describe is the way that we set up a test suite. So a suite is going to contain multiple tests, one or more tests. And so here I'm going to say we will describe our app. And then you pass it a callback. And then inside of that callback, you have multiple tests. And you test with the it keyword. So I'll say it renders hello world. And then inside of it is where we will write our specific test. So in testing, there's this 3 parts that we typically follow, which is arrange. We arrange and get our test set up, our unit test set up. We act, that is, do the things that a user would do with the specific component, and then we expect. We check to see that after the user interacted with the page, we have the expected outcome. So all of our tests are going to take this format. We might not always have an act, which I'll show it. In this case, we're not going to because it's a very simple test. But now we can do the testing. So I'm going to import app from app. So now we have that specific component. And we're going to do our arrangement. And in this case, we just need to render it. So I just pass the app component into render. And now I can use screen to interact with it. So for now, I'll do, let's expect that screen.get by role. So I'm specifically going to be checking for an H1 element on the page. So I'm going to get by role. I specifically am looking for a heading, because that's what an H1 is. And I want the level to be level 1. So that will find an H1 on the page if it is there. And then I want to expect that is to have text content. So specifically, that's going to give us a DOM element. And then we want to make sure that that text content is the string hello world. Now, I've got some linter errors right now. If I run my linter, it inserts the indentation and everything that it wanted. But this is my basic test. I'm going to render the app and then select the H1 and then make sure that that H1 has hello world inside of it. You can see in this case we didn't really do any acting, but act would come into play if you need to click a button or fill out an input or something like that. So now we need to run our tests. Let's set it up in our package.json. So if you go to package.json, we can add a script here called test, and that specifically we'll just call vitest. So now when we run npm test, it's going to call vitest. Vitest will search everywhere for any file that has the word test inside of it, and it will run those specific tests. So at this point, let's run the test. So if I do npm test, we'll see what happens. Oh no, a failing test. So if you remember earlier, we didn't have a hello world anymore. Now we just have that input. So this test is failing for a good reason. It got the wrong output. Like there was no H1 on the page. So let's fix that. For now, I'm just going to completely delete this form, add ourselves an H1, and then put the text hello world inside of there. We can run our linter. We'll do that. Now, by default, vitest watches for changes. and then we'll rerun the test. But you can see we're a bit closer. So right now, we expected the element to have hello world, but we got back hello world. So I forgot to capitalize the W. That is a thing. Yeah, people are telling me in the chat, it's gonna fail again. And nice, we have one passing test. So that's awesome. So we're set up for at least basic app tests. Later on, when we have things like HTTP requests, we're gonna wanna do some other setup, but this is good enough setup for now. What I wanna do is take a quick moment to talk about how you should select your elements and where to find good resources on that. So if you look in the testing library documentation, they actually have a ton of opinions and a ton of guidance on how you should write your tests and like what you should use to select elements. They have this page called Priority of Selecting. And they tell you that when you're selecting elements in your tests, you should go down this list and start at the top. So you should try to find a way to select the element by role. And what that actually is giving you is accessibility testing along with component testing. So if you select by role, not only are we testing that we could find the element, we're also testing that this page has a heading element that is level 1, and that's an accessible thing. In terms of accessibility, every page should have an H1. So by using that selector, you're getting accessibility testing and component testing all in one go. And this page basically says, if you can, use get by role. If you can't figure out a role for it, then do maybe label text, placeholder text, basically go down this line starting at the top, because the ones at the top are the more preferred ones. There's also a really good article written by Kinsey Dodds, the creator of Testing Library, that lists common mistakes with React Testing Library. And they specifically have they talk about the get by role right here. So this says, if you're getting by test ID, so this is a pattern you might see in some code bases where developers put test IDs all over their elements and such. So that way when you're writing tests, you can select that one specific element. But again, that's not testing accessibility. And it's not testing how a user would interact with the page. Whereas if you test this way, you're testing how a user would technically interact with the page. I am by no means an expert in accessibility. I just know there are certain things that you should do that are going to help with screen readers and people using the accessible features of your website. I've seen some apps and some teams that use test IDs. And the scenario that I saw it in, it was the testers were actually separate from the developers. And the testers were always like, hey, I need a test ID for this element because I can't figure out another way to select it. So that's one way of going about it. But specifically, testing library is telling you that's not a good practice to follow because you should be testing your components in the way that a user interacts with the page. Now, let's set up React Router. So by default, our React app is super basic right now. It just has a single component that just says hello world. We don't really have a way of having multiple pages. So we're going to set that up with React Router. Now, there are some other options for React Router, and we're at a point in time here in 2022 where there are some other things that are gaining in popularity. But React Router was and is one of the most popular for a very long time. So we're going to set this up. But just know there are other ones. They work similarly. We're going to go with React Router. So first off, we need to install it. We're just going to do an npm install of React Router DOM. And we are using React Router DOM version 6. Cool. So we have that as a dependency. And now we can set things up. So if we go over to our app.tsx, one of the things I like to do is I actually like to export my app that has all of the things wrapped around it. So specifically, you can see whenever we set up React Router, we wrap our app with that router. So I'm actually going to create a function called WrappedApp. And this, in turn, will have the, in my case, I'm going to use the HashRouter from React Router DOM. So it'll have that, and then it will have the app inside of it. And that is going to be the thing that I export by default instead of app. So this will be good for two things. For testing, we typically want to test our app that has all of the other stuff in it. So routing, and eventually if we set up context, that'll need to be here. Or anything else we need to wrap our app in, we would need to test against that. So it's easier to test against it if I'm just exporting that thing standalone with it wrapped. Now, we might actually create a separate version of app that is only wrapped with the things we need based on the tests that we're running. But for now, this makes sense to me. And so I specifically am bringing in HashRouter. BrowserRouter is another option, but BrowserRouter uses the history API and state to manage the different pages that you're on. But the issue with that is if you deploy this React app to a static file server, you usually will have to configure it to allow 404 redirects to the index. I don't want to have to do that, so we're going to use HashRouter because I can deploy this to any static CDN. I don't have to do any custom configuration, and my front-end routes will still work. People complain that the hash in the URL is ugly, but it allows me to, like I said, deploy to any CDN. Don't have to worry about redirect configuration or anything like that. Okay, now that we have exported the wrapped app, we should be good to go here because now the main.tsx is still importing app, but in this case it's getting the wrapped app because that is the default export. Over here I am just going to run my linter because it was things have changed since. So now that we are using the HashRouter, we can actually set up our routes. So for that, we specifically need the routes component and the route component. So routes wraps all of the route components that I'm setting up. So I can import both of those from HashRouter. So now we're going to make our app a little more complicated. I'm going to wrap it in a div. And it'll still say hello world for now. So that our tests still pass. And then I need the routes component. You can see that will import from React Router DOM. We'll do like that. And then I need the route component, which also gets imported from React Router DOM. Like that. A route has a specific path. So in this case, I want a path at /. So this is where I'm going to load my home page. And then I can specify an element that should load. So at this point, I need a home component. So what I'm going to do is here in my source directory, I'm going to create a folder called pages. And this folder is going to hold all of the components that are top level. Now, there's been a lot of different ways of doing this in the React world. Sometimes this is called containers. Sometimes it's called views. I'm going to call it pages. They all sort of mean the same thing. It's essentially the top level component that loads other components. So I'm going to create a component here called tsx. We'll have a function home. This one actually will just render the h1 hello world. So we can remove that from our app component. And then I'll export this default home. So now we have a basic home page. Over here in app.tsx, I'm going to import that home component. So pull it in from pages /home. Great. Now we can get rid of this hello world. And then right here, I can say element, and I specify that to be an instance of the home component. So now, when the page loads, when the route is /, it will load the home component. If I run my tests, they should work because we still technically have an h1 on the page after it renders. Awesome. Test pass. But let's also add like a NotFound page, and then we'll write a test to make sure that is working as well. I am going to get rid of these top level divs. I do just want my routes at the top level like that. And the test should still pass because I wasn't testing the structure. I was testing the contents, and so the contents is still there. Great. So at this point, let me add let's add just a NotFound page, and it's going to be pretty basic, similar to hello world, but instead of saying hello world, it will say not found. We're going to call this not found, and then I'll add this as well. Great, and so now we need a route. that whenever none of the other routes match, we show not found instead. So we'll create a route. In this case, we'll set the path as star. So if none of the other routes match, then we're going to load this specific component. And so here I'll do element equals, and then we want our not found, like this. Cool. So now if I go to a page that we didn't specify, in this case we've only specified the home page, we will see this not found page. So now let's test it out. And so in the browser here, if I want to go to these routes, because I'm using HashRouter, I always need to do /hash and then the specific thing that I'm looking for. So in this case, let's try to go to the banana route, which doesn't exist, and then our not found route gets loaded, which is great. So let's actually add a link on this page that goes back to the home page, and we can see another feature of React Router. So here in not found, let's add a link. We'll just do a little React fragment here. Get rid of that. And then right here, we'll add a link. So link gets imported from React Router DOM. So we'll have a link, and then inside of that link, I'll just say like, go home. And then we say this link wants to link to, and in this case, I'm just going to link to the / route. And so link is provided by React Router DOM. If I run my linter, it'll remove those double quotes, but it's provided by React Router DOM. And so now when I click on this, it specifically is going to use hash routing, and it's going to take me there to home. So if I save that, now we have this link, and if I click that, you can see we get back to the hello world route. So now that we have this not found route and we made sure that it works, let's actually write a test to test it. So over here in my app.test, I'm going to add another test underneath this one, and I'll say it renders not found if invalid path. And now we have to do things specific that actually have to do with React Router. So if you look on the testing library website, go to examples, they have a section on React Router, specifically React Router version 6, which is what we're using here, and they show you how you can set things up. So they have some example code which sets up a router, and then in their tests, they use this thing called a memory router. So one of the things we need to be able to do in order to test this not found route is we need to be able to essentially render our app and then like navigate to a specific path. The way we can do that is with memory router, because we can give it an array of paths that to load. And if we give it a path that would load not found, that would actually feed down into the app that gets rendered, and then our not found route would get rendered. So memory router is another thing provided by React Router DOM. You can see that we get BrowserRouter and HashRouter, which we're using, but we also get memory router. So that's what we want to use. So right now in our render, we specifically want to use this memory router from React Router DOM, and then we want to load our app inside of here. We're going to need to fix this in a second. I'll show you that. But we can provide initial entries, and in this case, it's an array, and we're just going to do like /banana. So we know that this should load the not found route because there is no path for, or there is no route for /banana. All right, let's fix our exports. So in our test before, we were actually testing our wrapped app. So you can see right here, we imported app, but if we look at app.tsx, we have our wrapped app as the default export. So that's the one that has the hash router on it. And as we add other libraries and such, it's going to have more things wrapping that app. That's not the one that we want to wrap with memory router. We want to wrap this standalone with memory router. So I'm also going to export specifically app, and now we can import these separately. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and remove the default export. So that way, when I'm importing, I can specifically choose which one of these I want to import. Do I want to import WrappedApp, or do I want to import app? Over here, we can now bring in both of those. I can bring in the wrapped app, and then I can bring in the app. Our initial test was for the wrapped app, like that. And then this test is for the non-wrapped app. This is a linter thing that's complaining about my my order of imports. You may have never seen this rule before, but I really like it. Essentially, all of the imports that are coming from your node modules go at the top of your file, and then anything you're importing that's files you wrote go below that. So I wonder if, yeah, eslint can fix that. It basically is like, oh, put that above the other one. I usually like to group them like that as well. Okay, so we've handled that there. This will actually result in a failing test, but let's see it fail, and then we'll run this. And specifically, we want, and actually, so let's test this for a failing test first. So let's just load the home page, / and then we want to do a similar expectation that we had before. But in this case, we want to expect that we see not found. But this should fail for multiple reasons. It's going to fail because I'm loading the /route, which actually should load hello world not found. And then also our main.tsx is broken because we changed the way that this was exporting. Although I don't know if our tests are going to pick that up. Let's see. Let's see. Let's do npm test. Cool. So yeah, we expected it to not have not found, but it had hello world. That is because we need to pass in a not found route. So right here, like this route does not exist. And because we're starting up the app with that router, it should load the not found route. So if I save that, we now have 2 passing tests. Great. So that actually didn't bring up the error I was thinking of. I think if we try to run the app, we should run into an error. Let's see. Yes, ambiguous indirect export. Basically, we're exporting 2 things now, app and WrappedApp. We don't have a default export. So over here in main.tsx, we need to fix that. We need to specifically import the wrapped app. And then we'll use that wrapped app right there. And then we get our hello world. So at this point, if you saw me talking about unit tests, you might be thinking, hey, this isn't a unit test, because we're basically testing the React router library. And you might be right. I just wanted to show some tests here. In the meantime, if we were to go in and update this code and for whatever reason get rid of this, we would now have a failing test that we don't have a not found route. And so that gives a little bit of benefit to this test. Basically, this test makes sure that in the future, if we accidentally remove that catch-all or something else, we have that test, which is capturing that functionality. However, what we're writing right now with unit are unit tests. If you look at vite is a unit testing library. So we're testing individual units. We're not testing the system as a whole. One of the people in the chat, NFG Codex, made a good argument that was, right now, we are actually testing React Router. Like, we're making sure that React Router works versus making sure that our app works. And that's more of an integration test because we're integrating with that library versus a unit test, which is testing one individual component. In this case, we probably would have unit tests for each individual component, like have a unit test for home, have a unit test for not found, instead of a test that is tracking to see and making sure which page gets loaded in this scenario. Though I will say there are some good use cases for testing when the path changes, does the right thing load? Because if we're testing the interaction of a page and interaction of a component, it might be that when a user action is done, they get redirected to the home page. And so we might want to check against that. And so we might have a test similar to this. So that's all I have to say about that. As we write more tests in our example apps, we'll make sure that we're testing the unit only. And we might use this example later if we are testing React Router specific things. So that's all for this setup video. Hopefully it was useful to you. Either you're following the setup along with me, or you can clone this setup that I created from GitHub. So github.com/codinggarden/react-ts-starter. It has all of the base code that we've written today. So if you're starting a React app and you need these specific dependencies, you can get up and going from there. But thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.